why story? Why now? So why do I actually need a story? And what makes it urgent? That's the why now part. And I feel like a lot of times when we work with clients, there's a desire to get to the story. Let's get to the what, let's get to the how, and the why gets a little bit, it's sort of like, well, we have that, it's on our value statement, it's on our mission statement, there's the vision, it's all there. But then when you ask someone, well, do you have a story about why you exist? Then it's kind of like, that's harder than a story about the product that I'm selling.
Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome CEO of Narrative.
And I'm Julienne Ryan, and it's good to see you, Jerome.
Good to see you too. Well, before we move on to our topic today, I just want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the podcast, Leadership Story Talks, leave a review, and check out our YouTube channel, because we also post this on YouTube. And you're going to see episode notes, and you'll be able to also go to narrative.com/podcast, where you can find previous episodes. So the more you leave a review, the more people know about it, and that's how we get the word of mouth going. So thanks so much for doing that. So today, I know it's you and me, Jules.
Yes, so we're doing a duet today, and it's just
That's
us.
right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So what's on your mind? I know what has been on my mind for the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, let's see. We had this, as our listeners know, our last episode was with someone named Lisa Donnells, who wrote this book called The Human Edge Advantage, and that prompted me to have things on my mind about that, as it relates really to our own methods around listening and storytelling. And I think the two things that I was really reflecting on were connection and authenticity, and how that gets created, because Lisa was really talking about connecting the heart, the head, and the gut, and how when one is able to do that, anyone, not just a leader, but anyone is able to do that, suddenly your capacity to solve problems is that much greater. And not only that, but you still have capacity left for other things, right? So, so I thought that was interesting, because we often talk about at Narrative, that storytelling, and especially when you can bring in a personal story, it really does connect the head, the hearts and minds is often an expression we hear around storytelling, and we've kind of seen that in action. So I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the relationship between leadership and storytelling, and this idea of connecting different parts of oneself, including even the right and left side of the brain, right?
It's funny because I wrote to her publisher today to even saying, like, the book has a place on my shelf in front of me that I'm looking at it, and I had I have to be frank, like when I heard it was more in my mind, when I heard we had this author coming on, I was like, oh, it's an HR book and leadership, and it's going to be, this is what you have to do, and bullet 1 and bullet 2. And I was like, okay, just keep yourself open and listen. And we typically have wonderful authors and people recommending the books to us. And I was so blown away, as you know, during the interview, because it was a whole mind and body, and raise the bar, I think, is the whole, to not be airy-fairy language right now. It's just raise the bar who's showing up, and expect more about yourself first and what that brings. And it's not just an intellectual experience. It's really a deeper thing if you want to excel in being a leader. So I was excited. And then you hit one of my favorite words about keep it authentic. So there's nothing like hearing somebody else repeat your own language back, and talk about context, and talk about, being open to experiences. So that hit all the buttons for us, and just the use of story. So I'm
Hmm.
thinking about how that keeps resonating with me, and how can we apply it in our work and bring this forward.
Yeah, and listening to you speak now and thinking back to that interview as well, I think one of the things we talked about, and that we talk about a lot on this podcast too, is the importance of purpose, and having an answer to the question why. Why are we doing this, and why does it matter? And I thought, in here we could today. One thought I had was to discuss a little bit that first step in the narrative method, which is to
Mm,
ask that question, why story? Why now? So, why do I actually need a story? And what makes it urgent? That's the why now part. And I feel like a lot of times when we work with clients, there's a desire to get to the story. Let's get to the what, let's get to the how, and the why gets a little bit, it's sort of like, well, we have that. It's on our value statement. It's on our mission statement. There's the vision. It's all there. But then when you ask someone, well, do you have a story about why you exist? Then it's kind of like, that's harder than a story about the product that I'm selling, right? And I think that's why it's interesting with the why story, why now question. That wasn't a question that originally in the method was there. It was really,
mm,
we started with listening and then we go into the story. But we changed that a few years ago and added this question of why story, why now? And it's really changed the way that people kind of approach storytelling, in my experience, because you might think that, well, hey, I'm going to be working with a storytelling company, or not. I
mhm.
just I know that a story is going to be the most effective way for my audience to remember what I'm saying. And so we just kind of go into it without sort of questioning, well, why am I telling a story? And I think that's a really important thing to do, even if you've told a story 1,000 times to different
Mhm.
audiences. Every time you're going to tell that story to a new audience in a new location, in a new venue, etc., at a new time, you still have to ask yourself that question, because once you answer that question anew every time, you're going to show up in a very different way.
Mhm.
And you're gonna show up in a way that's 100% present, because you've got your why in your head. You know why you're telling your story. And if you've answered the question now, then you've
Mhm.
created an urgency. And so again, you're going to kind of show up in a way that feels much more present than if you were just telling yourself, I'm going to just tell that story again because it worked so well the last 900 times I told it, right? But in the back of your mind, there's also a part that's a little bit bored by it, and that's also wondering, is it really going to work again or not? And all of those things come into play. They become kind of obstacles when you show up at the place, as opposed to starting fresh, even if it's the same story.
And I think it's important, that when we teach what we need to learn ourselves, I think that's the biggest. And the time we learn the most is when we're really engrossed in the topic. I think it's also good right now to remind people that even though they know the logo and they know the word, they read our web posts and our articles, why we're using story. Like
Hmm.
before we started, we were chatting about, we were catching up together, and we were saying, like you say, sometimes I work with people in their presentations. They're gonna launch a product, they have to have that big moment to get their board or their committees involved. I work in a variety of ways. I either come to an event and I'm asked to make people laugh or connect with each other, or I'm doing a workshop, or sometimes it's a little more intimate. And you have these situations where I'm coaching somebody and the story shows up because I'm doing like almost like a anthropological search to see what informs them and what influenced them. In
Hmm.
all those words they're going to use, they're going to be ingredients that we're going to do the traditional things. We're going to make a pitch, maybe for their interviews or their
Yeah.
conversations or the next. So we too have to kind of get out of our own way and say, why am I using this method? And and then be your own customers. Like you said was great, because I have been using a certain core story of how I got into storytelling, where I start to really appreciate it, not just play around with it. And each time I've done it, it's like, why are you using it now? And are you attached to it, or do you really need to say it? And is there a micro version you can give, just to give people an essence? So
Mhm.
it's being your own student and teacher at the same time. But let's go back to you when we were talking about like how we teach a method, and tell people being that intimate about themselves and owning themselves is probably the biggest gift we can do. Scary. I'm not saying it's not. It's hard. Or can be hard if you're
Yeah.
really digging deep. But where does it make a moment? Like, do you have an example where you got someone to take a risk about how authentic they could be and reap the
Mm.
benefits of owning that space?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, essentially, what you're asking is what's our answer to why story, why now, and which is
Exactly. In
yeah.
3 minutes or less, I hope that was the point. I'm like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, and why do we need a story? And it's a very valid one, because I mean, you just answered, but you ask yourself that question. I ask myself that question all the time, and just because I run a storytelling company doesn't mean that I actually don't question the why I'm telling a story, right? It shouldn't be taken for granted, and I do have an example. There's someone I just finished some work with. He's German, and I met him through a group training, and then we did some one-on-one coaching together. And the reason that he asked me to help him or to support him with something, is that he was going to do a big presentation. He moved from a corporate, high position in a corporation, and now is living the life of an entrepreneur. Started his own company in Germany, and got some funding, and they're kind of on their way, but it's really starting fresh after a 20-year career. So it's not the typical startup entrepreneur that perhaps we or our listeners have in their minds, right? And so he's kind of starting fresh. He needs some support. And then this was the first time that he was doing kind of a public presentation, where the ask was not to pitch his business, but it was to to give some advice and some tools, even, to a bunch of financial consultants and investment managers, high level people, and really kind of distill what he learned over this 20-year career, and now going into this entrepreneurial phase of his career. And so I think to say that he was terrified is the euphemism of the of the century. Yeah, because he had never been in that position, and he's only been in this kind of startup CEO mode for about a year. And so this is 6 months in, somebody asking, hey, could you give some lessons to people, based on your career? And he's like, well, actually, I'm not even sure I made it yet. But anyway, the reason I'm telling that as an example is because he really did feel that sort of fear of putting himself out there in a new way. And the new way was that he knew the reason that he contacted me was that he knew he wanted to insert much more of himself into this presentation, into this 20-minute talk, than he had ever done before. When he was a high-level leader, he was doing presentations all the time, but it was very rare that anything personal would come across. But the one little thing that he knew he wanted to say was that his son had told him during the pandemic, when suddenly his father, when suddenly he was there all the time, and he was there with his family, when previously he had been traveling he told me he traveled 80% of the time. So he was only home 20% of the time. And his son told him during the pandemic towards the waning days of the lockdowns, those first lockdowns, which were pretty drastic in Europe, you know, he knew that his father was going to start traveling again. And he said, "Oh, Dad, I wish you could just stay with us more like this, you know." And it tugged so much at his heartstrings that he put it in his mind at that moment in 2020, I'm going to do everything I can to fulfill, you know, what my son wants. And that's what he did. And then he managed to do that, and he quit his job, you know, 2 years later. And now he's working from home, and he's always there. And now the other thing that he knew he wanted to say is that his son told him recently, when I grow up, I want to be the CEO of your company. I want to take over from you, you know? And so, so of course we had our beginning and our end, you know, and but we still had to figure out the why, because he knew that he wanted to bring in those personal elements. But then you think of your audience. Okay, well, that's for me, right? That's fulfilling for me to be able to tell myself, well, I'm doing something for my son. But what does the audience care about that, you know, right? How do we get them to care about what's in it for them? And so that was interesting to then start to see, okay, well, he was starting to express that his why was really about, I want to be able to give something to people, give something that'll be actually useful and practical for them, another perspective, you know, because I've had the benefit of being in a corporate position like 95% of my audience, and then leaving that corporate position to start something else. And what he landed on was that what he ultimately did is that he left his comfort zone, and that paid not only benefits in terms of his career, but in terms of his overall health, his mental health, mental well-being, and also his family life, right? So it had so many different ramifications, this idea of leaving your comfort zone. And that's what we created as the thrust of that presentation, was that this was, it was even titled, Leave Your Comfort Zone and Reap the Benefits, right? So the whole presentation was about the lessons that he had learned every time he had left his comfort zone, and how the people in the audience could apply those lessons in their own careers.
I so enjoyed that, and thank you. He's going to be quite surprised when he finds when he's a lesson on a more global level.
Yeah.
And but I like so many things about what you share, and I was taking notes while you were talking.
Oh, good.
And yes, my scratchy handwriting. When you earlier on, when I was feeling what you were saying about that fear, like, what do I choose to share? And when you talk about your vulnerability, be frank here, will it distract my audience or our audience? Will it detract from what I'm trying to do? Because I know I like to make fun of myself and say, well, is that putting me in a position of being authority? What's the end, and what's intended you know, what I want to happen, or unintended? So it's always a struggle when you're asking somebody, whether it's myself or a client, to be vulnerable, because there's a cost and it's a gamble to say, what will they bear, and what will I need to figure out? So building that trust, and then making a leap, and then testing it to see. The other thing I liked, and there's maybe a deeper thing he can pursue after, is with this talk, because I'm sure he's going to recreate a version or a soundbite or two in conversations or in another presentation. He had certain ideals that he had. So first he lived to the ideal of the corporate European executive leader, solid, successful. And then his real coach, which is his son, you're one of them, but he's first coached him on, like, before you turn into a ghost and I never see you, what else could you be doing? So it's kind of that Joseph Campbell says, like, that creature shows up in our stories sometimes with the question or the incident that changes us. And I think that's interesting, because then he brings in the ideal of the romantic ideal as an entrepreneur. Well, he's at least smart enough, he got funded and he's got a cash flow. So he's like, he's dealing with the practical aspects now of running a business and owning his company and leading. But there's always ideals and knowing there's a cost to everything and how he's melding it too. So I think his call to action, people, was really good between the two at the comfort zone. But
Yeah.
I like the fact that you go one way, there's a risk. You go nowhere. If you go nowhere and just say, oh, it was wonderful, I was entrepreneurial and I had this idea and I went for it and everything's great, and you're like, okay, when you serve coffee, I gained nothing from this presentation. But to go there and show your hand first, especially for a crowd that's used to, you know, singing their own praises, it was a pretty gutsy thing to do, to talk to those folks. And probably he started from the top, basically. He started from a very interesting group as an audience to be his breakout performance in that role. So I give him high marks for saying yes and then figuring how he was going to say yes and show up. So he started with the end. You know, most people say I'm going to start small and, you know, start to do small speeches. He went out for the big guns. So that is an interesting lesson right there. And
well,
then
mirroring what it's kind of practicing what you preach, right? Because his whole thing is leaving your comfort zone. And so, you know, of course it made sense to me anyway, that that's what he would go for, because that's the kind of person he is. And you know, it was even the theme of it was even the benefits of living outside of your comfort zone. So it wasn't just leaving your comfort zone from time to time, it's actually living outside of it. And and you know, sort of showing that wasn't just the move from the corporate top level to the entrepreneur, but it was actually throughout his career. And that's kind of what he showed in his talk. And so he also dispelled this myth of the genius entrepreneur that I think we get into in popular culture, right? They're always in their 20s. They're usually white men. There's, you know, it's like they're in a garage or something like that. Now things are changing a little bit, but you know, that is kind of the myth that's in a lot of people's minds. And so meaning that, you know, once you've hit 30, well, it's done. You can never do that again, right? You've lost your chance of at entrepreneurship. Now, of course, when we look at data, it's very different. You know, most people who are entrepreneurs or call themselves entrepreneurs are middle-aged. They're not 20 and 30, you know. So but it was important to him to kind of show the reality of that before he actually resigned from his position, he spent 2 years building that business from, you know, 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. and from, you know, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. So all the times that he had free, essentially, that's what he was doing, you know? And so when he was ready,
version of business,
right, exactly. So
sleep.
Yeah, but I think it's important to tell those stories too, because otherwise it does become a you know, these myths, they kind of endure, and it's very discouraging. But I think when you look at what he decided to do, there were so many lessons that he learned that were applicable to people who you don't have to be you don't have to quit your job in order to leave your comfort zone. And that was the big message of it. And I think that's kind of where we landed on something powerful. And there's just one thing I want to say too, is that, or to add to all of this, he told this story and he did this presentation and got some great feedback. And then a week later, he had to do a pitch in one of those, you know, I think we might be familiar with this, you know, these kind of startup conferences where there's 1,000 people or so, and one by one people go in and they'll do a 5-minute pitch, and then there are investors in the room and that sort of thing. And he told me that he had never felt so in the flow than in that day, that he was completely in the zone and he answered all the questions. And I asked him, well, what do you think made the difference? He said, the presentation I did the week before. Even though I didn't tell the story, that was not the thing. But telling that story that day and doing that presentation in front of those people who were not entrepreneurs, who were not part of his field, it gave him such a tremendous confidence boost that when he showed up for that next presentation, He didn't have to retell the story because that's not what was needed. What was needed was to pitch his business, right? And he just felt like, wow, I was right there. And he said, I feel like that was the transformative process that you took me through, because suddenly when I got to be able to tell that story and to insert that personal part of my life, and to really make myself vulnerable and take that risk, it changed something in me. And he used the word transformation. And so, I think that's interesting, because we also think that once we found a story to tell and it works, let's just repeat that, or let's use the same steps of the method to tell another story, right? But in fact, what you can do is you can use the same principles that you learned through the process of telling your story. So in other words, storytelling principles, and apply those to any presentation, any pitch. And you can see, oh, that's a strong beginning because I've just said what was at stake for my audience. Oh, that's a strong ending. Oh, that's a strong turning point. That not so much, etc. So you start to analyze things in a little bit of a different way when you're much more privy to the process of storytelling.
I'm gonna raise my hand because I think in pictures, in metaphors, so I'm gonna make an analogy. What came to mind when you were talking about this and explaining, and it just really hit some chords because he had done the foundational work. And that sounds like a really fancy term, but you had together in all those times, he knew his key elements. He visited all the elements of his life. He knew who he was. So I pictured it as like a closet where you have all your suits and shirts hanging, and he knew what to pick. And I also thought in the midst of it, don't ask me how my brain gets there. There was a movie director years ago who worked on period films, and he said that even though the drawers in the wardrobes wouldn't be opened or people were looking, he still had the set designers buy all the period shirts and pajamas and anything that actor would need in that role at that time period. So it informed the character, and it was there. You will never see it. Really great stuff was hiding in that drawers that never was opened, but that actor knew it was part of him. He was living in that role. So when your colleague went to the stage, he had all those elements with him. He had already done his homework, and he knew exactly who he was when he showed up. Now he just had to answer 7,000 questions to investors, which is no small feat. But he had a lot of the doubts cleared out, and he was prepared. So I think this is great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's that thing where I love that analogy that you just talked about, because I think it describes it really well, what he was able to do. It's like you do the foundational work, and now that's in your toolkit, and it's in you, right? And I think what he did is he proved to himself that there was something that he could do, that he could go in front of an audience and tell a personal story, because that was not something that he had done before. And I think that's what I would encourage everyone who's listening to this.
Just be terrified a few times a week.
Exactly. Try it out. It's like, just, take a risk, and get that adrenaline going a little bit. Because then what happens is that when you go through the thing and you do it, then the endorphins hit. It's dopamine now, right? So it becomes quite satisfying and fulfilling. And then, of course, what we just talked about is that now you've done it. So you go to your next thing, and you've got that extra confidence. You've done something that you had never done before, and you walk into a room differently because of that.
However, I want to just say one last point. Yes, once we've done it, like when I started to do a book, when I started doing things, I approached life much differently when I started to own my voice and a bunch of other things. However, I would be lying that I go in without performance anxiety, where I don't get fearful when I have a new topic and I get invited to a keynote in May, April, or something else, and I'm like, what am I going to use? What am I going to bring? So it is that part that comes to pass. And then the best gift, I think it was Pavarotti years ago, listened to it on 60 Minutes saying that, that performance anxiety, but that anxiety is a healthy anxiety because it means he's preparing and upping his level. And with that, he wouldn't be totally present. So it's that energy that goes into it. So knowing what elements you're going to bring, what has to stay home, not needed, you're attached to a story, doesn't need to come with you, no, leave it behind, and figure out what works is a constant debate, but it's a healthy one.
Yeah.
And it is a productive, but if you have all the things you need, it just is like really an empowering experience, I think, too.
If you have all the things you need, and
the
that
joyful.
And you know that you've got the things that you need, right? It's that knowledge that really makes you show up in a different way. And even though you'll be nervous, you'll be anxious, that will never go away. But the thing is that, going back to where we started with the why do I need a story? Why now? In that moment of anxiety and nerves, there's two things one can do. Remember your breath, right? You've got, put your 2 feet on the ground and just take a breath. And then the other thing is remind yourself of why you're doing this for that particular audience. It's got nothing to do with you. It's not about self-promoting yourself. It's not about bragging or anything like that. It's about the why you're doing this for that particular audience. And what I always come back to in terms of my why is connection. It's as simple as that. All I'm trying to do is connect with somebody else. And the moment I remind myself of that, it's like, oh, okay. Out of connection grows a sense of possibility, a sense of opportunity. There's a purpose behind it. It's not about me. It's about the other person. Now I'm ready to go.
And I want that to be the word we lead maybe with the next time you and I buddy up and it's just you and me and our opinions and calling back to what we learned. So I wrote a word down, and then on our post-session conversation, I'll tell you what I'm hoping we talk about next time. All righty.
Nice. Great. What a great cliffhanger for our audience.
I know.
All right. Well, tune in next time to hear what that will be. Well, thanks a lot, Jules. I really appreciate this conversation as always. I feel like, we come in with an idea and then we go with it and we're not quite sure where it's going to lead, but I enjoyed this tremendously.
Thank you. As I always say, we're going to use something will come in handy when we experience and we'll use it one of these days. So we do that all the time with our work. Okay. Cheers.
Yeah. And if you, our listeners, have been inspired by this conversation, please consider enrolling your team in our training programs where we cover sales, leadership development, team building, and many other contexts as well. You can visit our website for that at narrative.com, NARATIV.com, for information on how you might be able to find, craft, and present stories that are going to engage your audiences like nothing else will, just like the example we talked about today. We're always ready and happy to listen to you. And my final ask is that you please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, and also go to our YouTube channel, because all of that drives word of mouth. And we want as many as you as possible to benefit from these conversations. So thanks again. And thanks, Jules, for being here today.
Thank you so much. Okay. See you soon.
All right. See you next time.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.